Welcome to the Flame Tree Myth and Fiction podcast.
Enemies to lovers, only one room left at the inn, falling in love beyond your station. Yes, that's right, romantasy and all of its glorious tropes return to the Myth and Fiction podcast. This month marks the release of 2 more beautiful books in our romantic fantasy series, Of Swords and Roses and Dreams Divine. In celebration, today's episode turns to tales of old-fashioned chivalry, court intrigue and quests of honour, all in the name of love. Prepare to hear the clash of swords, tension both spoken and unspoken, as well as the unrelenting call of destiny. Our first story has been selected from Romantic Fantasies of Swords and Roses and is titled The Thornblade's Promise by Laura Shenton. This one is for all of our devoted romantasy fans. It mixes romance with magic and escapism generously and unapologetically. I don't want to offer up any unintentional spoilers, so I'll pass you along to the author for a proper introduction to the story.
Hi, I'm Laura Shenton and I'm the author of The Thornblade's Promise, and I'm so excited that it's going to be included in a Flame Tree anthology. When I saw the theme of the anthology of Swords and Roses, I thought, oh, that's so exciting. That's got so much scope thematically and particularly in terms of romantasy. You know, I thought swords and roses, they're both such interesting things conceptually. You know, a sword can either be this violent, awful, damaging thing used to do terrible deeds, or it can be the thing that saves the day in the right hands. And, you know, roses, you know, they're beautiful, they're romantic, they're nature at its absolute finest, aren't they? But the thorns, you know, there's that kind of twist in how you perceive these things. You know, both swords and roses could be taken as something for good or for bad, even possibly evil, depending how you look at them. And I thought that's such an exciting theme, and that led on to me thinking about the story I was going to write. So the Thornblade, it is actually thematically it embraces both. It's a blade, and there's you know, some prophecy going on with regards to the roses. And my story includes lots of, you know, it's driven by prophecy. It's driven by the fact that these 2 characters have had other people's expectations placed on them on account of this prophecy, and you know, it's affected their lives. Calindra's thinking, why did Sarion leave? And Sarion's thinking, well, I had to, you know, it wasn't really an option. And I really like writing short stories because it's an opportunity to really get to the, you know, the heart of what the characters want, what they've experienced, where they are, where they're going. And, you know, there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of turmoil, in the sense that Calindra in particular, she's got it in her head that, you know, Sarion left, and that's just this hard, painful thing she has to deal with, because, you know, that's what's in the stars. And when she's met with the possibility that, you know, that might not be the case, you know, that's where the magic and the Thornblade really comes into it. And it's ultimately a story not just of love and hope, but of the idea that when people are told what to expect in life, and when they kind of project onto others, oh, this must be why they did what they did, it's not always the case with that. And, you know, that's where the magic of the Thornblade comes in, really. And, of course, the story has a happy ending, because I think that's what we want from a nice, uplifting, short romantasy story.
This is The Thornblade's Promise by Laura Shenton, read by Ruthie Durang, a brand new narrator for the Myth and Fiction podcast who we're really excited to have joining us.
The Thornblade's Promise by Laura Shenton. The roses in the royal garden bloomed dark crimson, their thorns gleaming like tiny daggers in the moonlight. Each petal seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life, fed by centuries of royal secrets buried beneath the ancient soil. Princess Calindra pressed herself against the marble pillar, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the shadow-cloaked figure move between the flower beds, graceful yet predatory. The silk of her midnight blue gown whispered against the stone, and she cursed the court seamstress who had insisted on such impractical beauty, even for a woman marked for death. She shouldn't be here. The Shadow Court's assassin had come for her, just as the prophecy had foretold, the one written in blood 3 centuries ago, when her ancestor had first claimed this throne through conquest and dark bargains. She was supposed to be safely locked in her tower, protected by her father's guards and his desperate hope that mortal steel could defeat destiny itself. The old king had aged a decade in the past month, ever since the seers had confirmed that tonight would bring the fulfillment of ancient words. When red roses bloom beneath the hunter's moon, the last heir shall taste the Thornblade's kiss, and the old kingdom shall know peace through ending. But Calindra had never been one to cower, not even as a child when the nightmares came crawling through her dreams like smoke given form. She had faced down court conspirators, rebellious lords, and even the dragon that had terrorized the eastern provinces last spring. She would not spend her final hours weeping in a tower, like some tragic, helpless maiden. The assassin stopped before the ancient rosebush at the garden's heart, the one that had grown there since the kingdom's founding, its roots intertwined with the very stones of the castle. The bush stood taller than a man, its trunk thick as a warrior's torso, covered in thorns that could pierce chainmail. Legend claimed it would bloom black when the royal bloodline ended, that it had been planted by the first king as both monument and warning. Its roses were the size of saucers, their petals soft as silk, but their stems armed with cruelty. Tonight, those petals remained red as fresh wine, red as the dress she had worn to her 18th birthday celebration, red as the blood that would soon fulfill the prophecy. "You came," the figure said, his voice like silk drawn over steel. Each word carried the weight of years and the promise of violence. He turned, and the moonlight caught the angles of a face she knew too well. Sharp cheekbones that could cut glass, eyes like winter storm clouds heavy with unshed snow, lips that had once whispered promises against her skin in stolen moments between duty and desire. A scar she didn't remember ran from his left temple to his jaw, silver against his olive skin. "I wondered if you would." The years had changed him. Gone was the lanky boy who had helped her escape etiquette lessons to climb trees and race horses through forbidden meadows. This man before her moved with lethal precision. His shoulders broader, his hands marked with calluses that hinted at weapons training and harder purposes. But his eyes, those storm-grey eyes that had haunted her dreams, remained achingly familiar. Sarion. His name escaped her lips, carrying years of sleepless nights and unanswered questions. The boy who had been her dearest friend, her first love, her greatest betrayal. The one who had vanished on the night she was to announce their engagement to a court full of scheming nobles who had never thought a stable's boy son worthy of their princess. He had left only a letter that shattered her heart into 1,000 pieces, each shard of pain cutting deeper than the last. "I am not the man you need me to be. Forget me and find someone worthy of your love." She had burnt the letter, but the words remained carved into her memory like scars on her soul. Now he stood before her in the garb of her enemies, leather and shadow silk that whispered of dangerous allegiances. The thorn blade of legend gleamed at his hip, a sword forged from meteoric steel that had fallen from the heavens themselves, bound with magic darker than midnight and hungrier than winter. The weapon that could cut through any defense, pierce any heart, end any life, including hers. Its crossguard was wrought to resemble thorny vines, and rubies like drops of blood adorned its pommel. In the moonlight, it seemed to pulse with its own malicious heartbeat. "You're the Shadow Court's champion," she whispered, pieces of the puzzle clicking together with devastating clarity. Stories uttered in the castle's dark corners suddenly made sense. Tales of an assassin who could walk through walls, who could kill with a touch, who served the ancient enemies of her bloodline with absolute devotion. The Thornblade bearer, the one they sent to fulfill the prophecy. His smile was almost menacing, but she caught the tremor at its edges, the crack in his assassin's mask. "Did you think I abandoned you for coin? For power? For the embrace of some foreign courtesan?" He stepped closer, and she caught the familiar scent of cedar that had always clung to his skin, now mixed with steel and something darker. "Everything I've done, every life I've taken, every piece of my soul I've bartered away, it has all been for you." "By joining those who would see me dead." The accusation came out stronger than she intended. Her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. "By becoming their weapon. By becoming strong enough to protect you." The words cracked like a whip, raw with years of suppressed pain. "Do you know what it's like? Loving someone you can never have, watching from the shadows as they parade suitors before you, princes and dukes and heroes with bloodlines pure as mountain snow, knowing that your love is nothing but a childhood folly to be discarded when duty calls." The Thornblade sang as he drew it from its sheath, but instead of pointing it at her heart, as she expected, he reversed his grip and offered her the hilt, his knuckles white with the effort of restraint. "The prophecy speaks of the last royal heir dying by this blade on the night the red roses bloom beneath the hunter's moon. But prophecies, my love, can be creatively interpreted." The blade was beautiful in its deadliness, etched with runes that seemed to shift and writhe in the moonlight. She could feel the power radiating from it, cold as winter's heart, yet somehow alive. The metal hummed with ancient magic, and she could see why legends claimed it could cut through the very fabric of reality itself. She stared at the weapon, overwhelmed by sudden understanding. "You want me to fake my death. I want you to choose your fate, instead of letting it choose you." His eyes burned with desperate intensity, and she saw in them the frightened boy he had once been. The one who had held her during thunderstorms, who had sworn to protect her from all the monsters in the world. "Take the blade. Cut yourself, just enough to draw blood, to make the magic believe. Let them think the prophecy is fulfilled while we disappear into the shadows together. I know paths through the whispering woods that lead to kingdoms beyond the reach of courts and prophecies." "And abandon my people, my kingdom." The words tasted bitter, but she had to voice them. She thought of the farmers struggling with failed harvests, of the villages on the border constantly under threat from shadow beasts, of the growing darkness that crept closer to the capital with each passing month. They need their princess, their hope. Your people will survive. They always do. But she heard the hollow ring in his voice, the lie they both recognized. But you... His composure cracked entirely, revealing the terrified young man behind the assassin's cold exterior. "You're all I have left, Callie. All I've ever had. When I close my eyes, I still see that little girl who found me crying in the stables because the other boys said I didn't belong. You were 7 years old, and you looked at me like I was worth saving. The memory hit her hard. She had been so young, so certain that kindness could heal any wound. She remembered taking his bloody knuckles in her small hands, remembered declaring with all the fierce authority of a child princess that anyone who hurt her friend would answer to her. I remember, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She remembered the day they'd first met, two lonely children in a castle full of courtly intrigue and adult games they didn't understand. He'd been a stable boy's son, with clever hands and eyes that saw too much, beaten for the crime of daring to dream beyond his station. She'd been a princess, trapped in silk and expectations, suffocating under the weight of a crown she would someday wear. They'd found freedom in each other, had sworn oaths of eternal devotion with rings made of braided grass and promises sealed with innocent kisses stolen in hidden alcoves. They had built a world of their own in stolen moments, chasing fireflies through moonlit fields, sharing books in dusty library corners, planning impossible adventures to distant lands where birth meant nothing and love meant everything. He had taught her to pick locks and climb walls, to see the castle's secret passages and hidden ways. She had shared with him her dreams of being more than just a pretty face to be married off for political advantage. But innocence was a luxury neither of them could afford anymore. The world had intruded with all its cruel realities, and childhood dreams had withered like flowers in brutal frost. "Tell me why you left," she whispered, reaching out with trembling fingers to trace the scar that ran along his jaw, a reminder of the violence that had shaped him in their years apart. "Tell me the truth. All of it." His eyes closed at her touch, and for a moment he was just Sarion again, her Sarion. "Because I found out what you were, what you could become." She didn't understand. You're flame-hearted, Callie. The last of the old bloodline, the one the prophecies really speak of. Not just any royal heir. You're the one who could burn down the Shadow Court with a thought, who could reshape the very foundations of magic itself. His hand covered hers where it rested against his face. They would have used you, controlled you, turned you into a weapon. So I made myself into one first. The revelation stole her breath. She'd always known she was different. The way flowers bloomed brighter in her presence. The way injured animals sought her out. The strange dreams that felt more like memories. But this... The Shadow Court offered me power, position, anything I wanted in exchange for your death, Sarion continued, his voice raw. What they didn't know was that I'd already chosen what I wanted most. You, alive and free, even if it meant you could never be mine. Tears pricked her eyes like thorns. You fool. Did you never think to simply ask me to run away with you? A princess and a stable boy's son. They would have hunted us to the ends of the earth. But an assassin and his victim might simply disappear. She understood now, saw the twisted brilliance of his plan. Let the world think Princess Calindra was dead, murdered by the Shadow Court's blade. Let Callie, the flame-hearted, be born from her ashes, free to choose her own destiny. The thorn blade hummed as she wrapped her fingers around its hilt. The metal was warm, almost alive, and she could feel the magic thrumming through it like a second heartbeat. This was the weapon that had ended dynasties, that had drunk the blood of kings and queens. "If I do this," she said slowly, "there's no going back. Calindra dies tonight." "I know." His hand covered hers on the blade's grip. "Are you ready to become who you were always meant to be?" She thought of her father, grey-haired and weary, ruling a kingdom that grew smaller and weaker with each passing year. She thought of the people in the villages, struggling to survive as magic drained from the land. She thought of the Shadow Court, growing stronger in their hidden realm, preparing to sweep across the mortal world like a plague. And she thought of the power sleeping in her blood, the fire that could burn away the old world and forge something new. Together? She asked. Always. She pressed the tip of the blade to her fingertip, just hard enough to pierce the skin. A single drop of blood bloomed, a bead of ruby born of sharp pain, but not unwelcome. By blood and blade, she whispered, the old ritual words coming to her lips unbidden. By love and sacrifice, let the old world die so a new one may be born. Magic erupted around them like wildfire, turning the air itself to flame and starlight. The ancient prophecy shattered, its power redirected by will and love and the bright courage of a girl who refused to be anyone's pawn. Sarion's arms came around her as the transformation took hold, as Princess Kalindra dissolved into light and shadow, leaving only Callie in her place. Callie the flame-hearted, whose story was just beginning. "Where do we go now?" she asked against his shoulder, feeling the new power singing in her soul. His smile was beautiful and full of promise. "Wherever we choose. The Shadow Court thinks they've won, but they've created their own destruction. We'll teach them what it means to underestimate love." Hand in hand they walked into the darkness beyond the garden, leaving behind the echo of a prophecy fulfilled in ways its makers never could have imagined. Behind them the castle slept on, unaware that their princess had died and been reborn, that destiny itself had been reforged in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The thorn blade rested at Sarion's side, no longer a weapon of assassination, but a guardian's promise, while magic flared beneath Callie's skin. They had work to do, a world to save, enemies to face. But they would face them together, as they always should have, bound by a love stronger than any prophecy and sharper than any blade.
I adore that this story fully embraces everything that readers of romantasy cherish. A love that knows no bounds and weathers all odds, in a setting of whimsy and magic. Laura Shenton really manages to capture such a strong character relationship within the constraints of a tight anthology brief and a short word count. For our next story, we journey into a world more ancient and unforgiving, but commonly using a sword as an emblem of power, history, and fate. You may have heard of Theseus, the Greek hero, perhaps best known for slaying the Minotaur. Well, whether you've heard of him or not, I urge you to consider whether the man would still be considered a hero without his sword. This one can be found in our Heroes and Heroines, Myths and Tales anthology. But this version of the Theseus story was first published by British historian Helene Adeline Gruber in 1896. We've got Nathan Chatilier, voiceover artist, lending his talent to this one.
Theseus, narrated by Nathan Chatilier. When yet but a very young man, Aegeus, king of Athens, journeyed off to Troezen, where he fell in love with and married a pretty young princess by the name of Aethra. For some reason which mythologists do not make known, the king was forced to return alone to Athens. But ere he departed, he concealed his sword and sandals beneath a stone, bidding his wife remember that, as soon as the strength of their son Theseus permitted, he must raise the rock, appropriate sword and sandals, and come and join him in Athens, where he should be introduced to the people as his son and heir. These instructions given, Aegeus bade a fond farewell to his wife and infant son, and returned home. As the years passed by, They brought strength, beauty, and wisdom to Theseus, whose fame began to be published abroad. At last Aethra deemed him strong enough to raise the rock beneath which his father's trusty weapon lay, and, conducting him to the spot where it was, she told him the whole story and bade him try his strength. Theseus immediately obeyed. With a mighty effort he raised the rock, and, to his great satisfaction, found the sword and sandals in a perfect state of preservation. Sword in hand, he then set out for Athens, a long and dangerous journey. He proceeded slowly and cautiously, for he knew that many dangers lurked along his pathway, and that ere he reached his father's city, he would have to encounter both giants and monsters who would strive to bar his way. He was not at all mistaken in his previsions, for Troezen was scarcely lost to sight ere he came across the giant Periphetes, son of Vulcan, who stood in the road and attacked with a huge club, whose blows were generally fatal, all who strove to pass. Adroitly evading the giant's first onslaught, Theseus plunged his sword deep into his huge side ere he could renew the attack, and brought him lifeless to the ground. Theseus then disarmed his fallen foe, and, retaining the club for future use, continued his journey in peace, until he came to Isthmus of Corinth, where 2 adventures awaited him. The first was with a cruel giant named Sinus, nicknamed the Pine Bender, whose usual practice was to bend some huge pine until its top touched the ground, and called to any unsuspecting passerby to seize it and lend him a helping hand for a moment. Then, as soon as the innocent stranger had complied with his request, he would suddenly let go the pine, which, freed from his gigantic grasp, sprang back to its upright position and hurled the unfortunate traveller way up in the air, to be dashed to pieces against the rocky mountainside. Theseus, who had already heard of the giant's stratagem, skillfully eluded the danger, and finally caused Sinus to perish by the same cruel death which he had dealt out to so many others. In one place, the Isthmus of Corinth was exceedingly narrow, and the only practicable pathway led along a rocky ledge guarded by a robber named Sciron, who forced all who tried to pass him to wash his feet. While the traveller was thus engaged, and knelt in the narrow pathway to do his bidding, he would suddenly raise his foot, kick him over the side, and hurl him down into the sea below, where a huge tortoise was ever waiting with gaping jaws to devour the victims. Instead of yielding to Sciron's exactions, Theseus drew his sword, and by his determined bearing so terrified the robber that he offered him a free passage. This offer, however, did not satisfy Theseus, who said he would sheathe his sword only on condition that Sciron performed for him the menial office he had imposed upon so many others. Sciron dared not refuse, and obeyed in fear and trembling, but he was doomed never to molest any one again, for Theseus kicked him over the precipice into the breakers, where the tortoise feasted upon his remains with as keen a relish as upon former victims. After disposing of another world-renowned robber, Cercion, the wrestler, Theseus encountered Procrustes, the stretcher, a cruel giant who, under pretext of entertainment, deluded travellers into entering his home, where he had 2 beds of very different dimensions, one unusually short, the other unusually long. If the unfortunate traveller were a short man, he was put to bed in the long bedstead, and his limbs were pulled out of joint to make him fit it. But if, on the contrary, he were tall, he was assigned the short bed, and the superfluous length of limb was lopped off under the selfsame pretext. Taking Procrustes quite unawares, Theseus gave him a faint idea of the sufferings he had inflicted upon others by making him try each bed in turn, and then, to avoid his continuing these evil practices, put an end to his wretched existence. Theseus successfully accomplished a few more exploits of a similar character, and finally reached Athens, where he found that his fame had preceded him. The first tidings that there reached his ear were that Aegeus had just married Medea, the enchantress. But although these tidings were very unwelcome, he hastened on to his father's court to make himself known, and received the welcome promised so many years before. Medea, seated by Aegeus's side, no sooner saw the young stranger draw near than she knew him, and foresaw that he had come to demand his rights. To prevent his making known claims which might interfere with the prospects of her future offspring, she hastily mixed a deadly poison in a cup, which she filled with fragrant wine, and bade Aegeus offer it to the stranger. The monarch was about to execute her apparently hospitable purpose, when his eyes suddenly rested upon the sword at Theseus's side, which he immediately recognized. One swift glance into the youth's open face convinced him that Aethra's son stood before him, and he eagerly stretched out his arms to clasp him to his heart. This sudden movement upset the goblet, and the poisonous contents, falling upon a dog lying at the king's feet, caused his almost instantaneous death. Seeing her crime discovered and Theseus recognized, Medea quickly mounted her magic dragon car and fled to Media, whence she never returned. One day, some time after his arrival at Athens, Theseus heard a sound of weeping and great lamentation throughout all the city, and in reply to his wandering inquiries was told that ever since an unfortunate war between the Cretans and Athenians, the latter, who had been vanquished, were obliged to pay a yearly tribute of 7 youths and as many maidens, destined to serve as food for the Minotaur. Further questions evolved the fact that the Minotaur was a hideous monster, the property of Minos, king of Crete, who kept it in an intricate labyrinth constructed for that express purpose by Daedalus, the far-famed architect. This labyrinth was so very intricate that those who entered could not find their way out. These varied details kindled Theseus's love of adventure and still further strengthened him in his sudden resolve to join the mournful convoy, try his strength against the awful Minotaur, and, if possible, save his country from further similar exactions. Even his father's tears and entreaties were powerless to move him from his purpose, and, the hour having come, he embarked upon the black-sailed vessel which was to bear the yearly tribute to Crete, promising to change the black sails for snowy white ones if he were fortunate enough to return victorious. Favourable winds soon wafted the galley to Crete, and as they sailed along the coast, searching for the port, they were challenged by the brazen giant Talos, who walked daily thrice around the whole island, killing, by contact with his red-hot body, all who had no business to land on that coast. Knowing, however, that the black-sailed galley brought a fresh supply of youths and maidens for the terrible Minotaur, Talos let it pass unharmed, and the victims were brought into the presence of Minos, who personally inspected each new freight load to make sure he was not being cheated by the Athenians. At the monarch's side stood his fair daughter Ariadne, whose tender heart was filled with compassion when she beheld the frail maidens and gallant youths about to perish by such a loathsome death. Theseus, by right of his birth, claimed the precedence, and proffered a request to be the first victim, a request which the king granted with a sardonic smile, ere he returned unmoved to his interrupted feast. Unnoticed by all, Ariadne slipped out of the palace and, under the cover of darkness, entered the prison where Theseus was confined. There, she tremblingly offered him a ball of twine and a sharp sword, bidding him tie one end of the twine to the entrance of the labyrinth and keep the other in his hand, as a clue to find the way out again should the sword enable him to kill the dreaded Minotaur. In token of gratitude for this timely assistance, Theseus solemnly promised Ariadne to take her with him to Athens as his bride, were he only successful in his undertaking. At dawn the next day, Theseus was conducted to the entrance of the labyrinth, and there left to await the tender mercies of the Minotaur. Like all heroes, he preferred to meet any danger rather than remain inactive, so, mindful of Ariadne's instructions, he fastened his twine to the entrance, and then boldly penetrated into the intricate ways of the labyrinth, where many whitening bones plainly revealed the fate of all who had preceded him. He had not gone very far before he encountered the Minotaur, a creature more hideous than fancy can paint, and he was obliged to use all his skill and ingenuity to avoid falling a prey to the monster's appetite, and all his strength to lay him low at last. The Minotaur slain, Theseus hastily retraced his footsteps. Arrived at the palace where his ship rode at anchor, he found his companions and Ariadne awaiting him, and, springing on board, bade the sailors weigh anchor as quickly as possible. They were almost out of reach of the Cretan shores when Talus came into view, and, perceiving that his master's prisoners were about to escape, leaned forward to catch the vessel by its rigging. Theseus, seeing this, sprang forward and dealt the giant such a blow that he lost his balance and fell into the deep sea, where he was drowned, and where thermal springs still bear witness to the heat of his brazen body. The returning vessel, favoured by wind and tide, made but one point, Naxos, and here youths and maidens landed to view the beautiful island. Ariadne strayed apart and threw herself down upon the ground to rest, where, before she was aware of it, sleep overtook her. Now, although very brave, Theseus was not very constant. He had already grown weary of Ariadne's love, and when he saw her thus asleep, he basically summoned his companions, embarked with them, and set sail, leaving her alone upon the island, where Bacchus soon came to console her for the loss of her faithless lover. Theseus, having committed a deed heinous in the eyes of gods and men, was doomed to suffer just punishment. In his preoccupation, he entirely forgot his promise to change the black sails for white, and Aegeus, from Attica's rocky shore, seeing the sable sails when the vessel was yet far from land, immediately concluded that his son was dead, and in his grief cast himself into the sea since known as the Aegean, where he perished. Theseus, on entering the city, heard of his father's death, and when he realized that it had been caused by his carelessness, he was overwhelmed with grief and remorse. All the cares of royalty and the wise measures he introduced for the happiness of his people could not divert his mind from this terrible catastrophe. So, he finally resolved to resign his authority and set out again in search of adventures which might help him forget his woes. He therefore made an excursion into the land of the Amazons, where Hercules had preceded him, and whence he brought back Hippolyta, whom he married. Theseus was now very happy indeed, and soon all his hopes were crowned by the birth of a son, whom he called Hippolytus. Shortly after this joyful event, the Amazons invaded his country under pretext of rescuing their kidnapped queen, and in the battle which ensued, Hippolyta was accidentally wounded by an arrow and breathed her last in Theseus's arms. Theseus next set out with an Athenian army to fight Pirithous, king of the Lapithae, who had declared to war. But when the armies were face to face, the two chiefs, seized with a sudden liking for each other, simultaneously cast down their weapons, and, falling on each other's necks, embraced and swore an eternal friendship. To show his devotion to this newly won friend, Theseus consented to accompany him to the court of Adrastus, king of Argos, and witness his marriage to Hippodamia, daughter of the king. Many guests were of course present to witness the marriage ceremony, among others Hercules and a number of the centaurs. The latter, struck with admiration for the bride's unusual beauty, made an attempt to kidnap her, which was frustrated by the Lapithae, seconded by Theseus and Hercules. The terrible struggle which ensued between the conflicting parties has ever been a favourite subject in art, and is popularly known as the battle between the centaurs and Lapithae. The hotly contested bride did not, however, enjoy a very long life, and Pirithous soon found himself, like Theseus, a disconsolate widower. To avoid similar bereavement in future, they both resolved to secure goddesses, who, being immortal, would share their thrones forever. Aided by Pirithous, Theseus carried off Helen, the daughter of Zeus, and as she was still but a child, entrusted her to the care of his mother, Aethra, until she attained a suitable age for matrimony. Then, in return for Pirithous' kind offices, he accompanied him to Hades, where they intended to carry off Proserpina. While they were thus engaged, Helen's twin brothers, Castor and Pollux, came to Athens, delivered her from captivity, and carried her home in triumph. As for Theseus and Pirithous, their treacherous intention was soon discovered by Hades, who set the first on an enchanted rock from which he could not descend unassisted, and bound the second to the constantly revolving wheel of his father, Ixion. When Hercules was in Hades in search of Cerberus, he delivered Theseus from his unpleasant position, and thus enabled him to return to his own home, where he now expected to spend the remainder of his life in peace. Although somewhat aged by this time, Theseus was still anxious to marry and looked about him for a wife to cheer his loneliness. Suddenly, he remembered that Ariadne's younger sister Phaedra must be a charming young princess, and sent an embassy to obtain her hand in marriage. The embassy proved successful, and Phaedra came to Athens, but young and extremely beautiful, she was not at all delighted with her aged husband, and instead of falling in love with him, bestowed all her affections upon his son, Hippolytus, a virtuous youth who utterly refused to listen to her proposals to elope. In her anger at finding her advances scorned, Phaedra went to Theseus and accused Hippolytus of attempting to kidnap her. Theseus, greatly incensed at what he deemed his son's shameful actions, implored Poseidon to punish the youth, who was even then riding in his chariot close by the shore. In answer to this prayer, a great wave suddenly arose, dashed over the chariot, and drowned the young charioteer, whose lifeless corpse was finally flung ashore at Phaedra's feet. When the unfortunate queen saw the result of her false accusations, she confessed her crime, and in her remorse and despair, hung herself. As for Theseus, soured by these repeated misfortunes, he grew so stern and tyrannical that he gradually alienated his people's affections until at last they hated him and banished him to the island of Skyros, where, in obedience to a secret order, Lycomedes, the king treacherously slew him by hurling him from the top of a steep cliff into the sea. As usual, when too late, the Athenians repented of their ingratitude, and in a fit of tardy remorse deified this hero, and built a magnificent temple on the Acropolis in veneration of him. This building, now used as a museum, contains many relics of Greek art. Theseus's bones were piously brought back and inhumed in Athens, where he was long worshipped as a demigod.
No warm and fuzzy feelings evoked by this one. Challenge after challenge is thrust in Theseus's direction, from the second he retrieves his father's hidden sword. The blade is simultaneously a curse, a test, and a birthright. Today's stories have really got me thinking about the role of these weapons in storytelling. Swords never seem to be merely objects of steel, but always weighted with an abstract importance, often spanning generations. So I ask you now, does the sword make the man or woman? Join us next week for an episode where we take a look at another Greek hero, Odysseus, although you should expect his story to be told in a very different way.
Thanks so much for listening. We really hope you enjoyed this episode of the Flame Tree Myth and Fiction podcast and look forward to the next episode. Do recommend it to your friends. Goodbye for now.